Welcome to another of our Pakistan at 100 podcast series. I'm joined today by the World Bank's Chief Economist for the South Asia region, Hans Timmer. Hans, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much.
First of all, start us off by telling us what it is that you do. What's the job of the Chief Economist of the region?
Before I answer that question, let me first say that it's really a pleasure to be at LUMS. It's my first time in Lahore. Since I started recently as Chief Economist, my first time in Pakistan. So I'm very eager to learn, and where can you better learn than in one of the best universities of Pakistan. But also it's nice to be at the university because when we are talking about the next 30 years, it's the graduates from this university that help shape the country. So now your question, the role of a Chief Economist in the World Bank, it's a very free role. By design, we don't have an operational agenda. That means that we can be very free on challenging conventional wisdom. And that's what we do, both within the bank and within countries. We try to trigger debate. We challenge people, but we do that on the basis of very solid research.
So we know that you've just joined, 2 months ago
Yes.
in your current position. But tell us a little bit about how you see the different economies of South Asia as they stand today, and what do you think of the region's prospects over the next, let's say, 2 or 3 decades?
Yeah, I visited now Colombo, Sri Lanka, and Delhi in India. It's difficult to really get a good view of all the differences. I think all countries have challenges. What you see in all countries is that there is a very low participation rate of women. That is a big challenge. All countries are underperforming in exports. All countries have a top-down organization of the economy. So I think the biggest challenge for all countries is to unleash that potential that is not used now, either by reducing the top-down approach or by involving more women to make sure that young people can use the new technologies, the digital technologies, that they can export more. I see that in Sri Lanka, a big problem was the very small formal labor market that was dominated by the government, and a lot of students they actually want to work for the government because that's the only place where you have security, and that impedes the development of the private sector. I see here in Pakistan more dynamism in the private sector. I see in India a tendency towards more decentralization. I see in many countries the fiscal federalism, but in general I think for all countries the biggest challenge is to unleash the potential bottom up.
And if you look at growth trajectories, South Asia has diverged as a region. Within the region, there's been a divergence in the last 30 years or so, where countries like India and Bangladesh have really taken off since the 90s. A country like Sri Lanka has gone through a sort of a patchy experience. They've had a few years of a lot of growth and other years that they've not done so well. And then you look at sort of Nepal, that's done a little worse, and Pakistan, which is in relative terms stagnated. What do you think are the key differences that have allowed some countries to accelerate compared to others?
Stagnated is a strong word. It's probably 4.5% growth, which is lower than the 7-8% growth that we see in India. I think one of the challenges of the countries that were not growing on average very fast was that there was internal tensions, political tensions, and that you have the cycles that go up and down. You have a reform cycle, but then it's difficult to finish that. You fall back, and then you have to wait for another reform cycle again. And in Nepal, in Sri Lanka, and in Pakistan also, you have political and geopolitical tensions. That's not easy to overcome.
Yeah. All right. Let's move then to talking about the role of the government in the economy. And this can be, you can answer this more broadly than South Asia. But what do you think of the extent to which governments have an ability or capacity to course correct the economy, and to what extent is it exogenous factors?
No, as I said earlier, I think one of the problems is that governments want to correct too much, wants to control too much, wants to solve by themselves the problems too much, instead of creating the conditions that others can do that. Let me give you one example. Also in the World Bank, but in the countries, I hear a lot about the challenge of creating jobs. The region has to create every month 1 million additional jobs, and then everybody is very anxious and almost panicking. How do you do that? And indeed, as government or as an individual, it seems almost impossible, but that's completely the wrong approach, I think. These jobs will be created because the countries are big, there are many people. In terms of growth rates, it's not even that exceptional, so that shouldn't be the worry of people. The worry should be, how do you create conditions that these jobs are getting better and that people can exploit the opportunities that they see for themselves.
So you've actually touched upon a sore point. I've often seen in Pakistan the discourse around the creation of jobs seems to be you have to sort of build the job. So the government's role is to build the job itself, whereas what you're saying, what I've come to believe from my training as an economist, is that you really need to create the preconditions or the environment for private enterprises to grow and to create valuable jobs, right? And that actually brings me to something else, which is how sophisticated is this region in terms of how we think of the economy, and as a result, the types of policies that gain traction.
I must say that I'm very impressed by the debates in these countries. Yesterday I spent more than 3 hours at the central bank, first with a large group of people, more than 100, and then another 1.5 hours with senior management, and it was very, very sophisticated, both in the large group and in the smaller group. So there's a lot of understanding of how the economy works. Abroad, there are many very good economists from this region, from Pakistan, from Sri Lanka, from India, but apparently that's no guarantee that all the problems are being solved. And so I think it is not the problem of the quality of the debate, it is probably an issue of vested interest. It's an issue of capture that makes it difficult to be consistent in the reforms, and that's not easy to change. It's an issue of political economy, but that's where universities play a very important role. That's where young people that are coming into the labor market play a very important role. And given all the changes that we are seeing in the world economy, it is very clear that you cannot continue to go on the old system. And this is a period where you need bold decisions to open up parts of the economy.
So let's just break this down a little bit, pass it out if you will. Let's start with vested interests. How do vested interests impact the economy when they do have that sort of influence?
So there's still a lot of protection, also in Pakistan. When we had yesterday a meeting with the big businesses, then you see that the debate is very sophisticated, but at the same time, many of the companies, they ask for protection and they ask for subsidies and they ask for exceptions, instead of going all out in making sure that there's more competition, instead of going all out in solving the environmental problems, or making sure that there are more opportunities for women in the companies.
So basically, politically powerful groups create, either by articulating a better articulating better reasonings for their preferred policies, or by creating pressures of other sorts, harness for themselves a playing field that's not level, is what you're saying, and this in turn diminishes the size of the economic pie overall. This is a sort of standard argument about the role of politics and how it impacts economics around the world. And so you're pointing to the university as one sort of lever that we have to get at this problem. Can you articulate for us a bit more both what you're stating about the university and potentially other levers we might have to tackle this problem of vested interests?
Yeah, I pointed universities because I think the solution will ultimately come from young people, the people who don't have the vested interest anymore.
Okay.
And the solution is coming from people with a lot of brains, and they're coming from the university also. Before I started this job, I worked in Europe and Central Asia for 5 years as chief economist. And what you see in that region, including in Western Europe, is that politicians are losing the young people. And the reason is that young people, they live in a very different world. In many countries, 80% of them, they don't have a standard employment contract anymore. They have part-time contracts, they have temporary contracts, they sometimes work two jobs at the same time, or they have a startup and they are self-employed. And they work a lot in the new digital economy, which functions very, very differently from the old economy. And so they realize that all the regulations that were put in place, all the social safety net that were put in place, they don't work for them. So they start pushing back. And I think that is what will happen in South Asia also.
That sort of, if you point to Europe as an example of the power of the young, it actually also serves as a warning, because what seems to have happened in the last 4 or 5 years is that a large sector of society that's felt disenfranchised across many democracies has come forward to vote in parties that are seen as more right-wing than has historically been the case. And so if you look at a country like Pakistan, if you think about the young taking control, it could go either way, right? It could go towards bursting the barriers that these vested interests have put up. So if it could move us towards misadventure also in some senses. And so that sort of suggests to me that there's great urgency in reaching the youth and in getting the right messages around.
And understanding what the problems is that they are struggling with, and then going all out and being relentless in solving those problems. Right. I think you're right that in Europe, and perhaps here also, there's a lot of populism. There are politicians that use that sentiment to try to go back in time, to try to become nationalistic. But in general, I think that's not really what the young people want. Look at Brexit. The young people didn't vote for Brexit. The young people, they saw the opportunities of an integrated Europe. It was often the older people that see all those changes coming and are afraid of that, sometimes for good reasons, that they want to go back to the past. They see a lot of immigration, they don't know how to handle that, and they go to the more populist parties.
Okay. The World Bank in Pakistan has invested a lot of energy over the last year or so thinking about Pakistan's 30-year future, out to Pakistan at 100 or Pakistan in the year 2047. Our initiative at LUMS has collaborated on this effort, and these conversations are part of that. Let's be more impatient though. Let's think next 5 years. What do you think are maybe the top 3 or 4 or 5 things that we need to do to course correct in the short term?
No, I think you have to look for the low-hanging fruits. Always when big reforms are needed, you have to show that there are positive results also. It's not all pain, and you only get the positive results at the end. And so I would focus relentless on increasing the role of women. I would focus relentless on opportunities of young people to start jobs using the new technologies, and not just using that in the non-tradable domestic sector, but help them also entering the global markets. In other countries you see that is a possibility, and I would listen a lot to both the women and the young people to see what the constraints are that they are feeling, and then try to solve that. I'm from the Netherlands. In the 1960s, the participation rate of women was extremely low in the Netherlands. It was some 20 percentage points lower than in the rest of Europe. It's probably had cultural backgrounds. The decision was made during the 1960s. It had to change. And the whole society, including the government, was relentless. And there was no single bullet, there was no clear policy, but they tried everything, from childcare to opening shops later, to changing education. 20 years later, we were at par with the rest of Europe. It is possible. If you really see it as a priority, and you are very flexible in your approach, and you try to achieve small wins in the short run, and then you go on and you go on, then ultimately you will reach it.
So one of the senses that we've sort of come to in the course of these conversations in the last year that we've had is that there's great potential here, but also great urgency, because Pakistan is at a stage where it could go either way. We could really degrade by not paying enough attention to the aspirations, but also the capabilities of our youth. But there's also equally a lot of opportunity. What's your sense of Pakistan in the next 10, 15, 20, 30 years? And what do you think of, I'll let you wrap this up. This is my last question to you. What do you think are some of the most promising things and some of the scariest things about this country in the next few years?
I think the most promising thing is that people realize the challenges, also the people in power, they realize the challenges. I think it is very promising that you have very deep debates on how to solve it. Where I'm more scared is in the practical application, whether that understanding leads to, as you said, that sense of urgency and the relentless drive to solve the problems now, and to listen to the people who will ultimately have to do that.
All right. Well, Hans, we're short on time, so thank you very much. Just wanted to get some sense. And what I'm hearing from you is that there's, again, great potential, but it's up to us to distill a lot of the debates down into actionable plans and then see them through. Well, thank you very much for
Thank you very much for having me.